And so I set myself to writing a book that would trace the evolution of this Christian revolution from the pre-Christian world right the way up to the present day. And I'd written 2 or 3 chapters of it when I got a commission from a British TV company to go to Iraq to make a film about what it was that motivated the Islamic State, ISIS, this radically, brutally militant Islamist organization. And specifically to focus on why it was that they were targeting Christians and a particular religious minority called Yazidis for persecution. And so I went to Iraq, and we got permission from the Kurdish government in the north of the country to visit a city called Sinjar. And Sinjar had been, there had been Christians settled there, there'd been Shia Muslims there, Sunni Muslims, and a lot of Yazidis. There aren't many Yazidis in the world. There are about, I should think, about 300,000. But a sizable proportion of them were in this particular town called Sinjar. And in 2014, when the Islamic State moved from Syria into northern Iraq, captured Mosul, they also captured Sinjar. And while they were in Sinjar, they crucified many of the men, and they enslaved many of the women, and not just women, they enslaved girls who were as young as 8. And in 2016, Sinjar got recaptured by the Kurds, and we were allowed to go there a few weeks after the city had been recaptured. But it was still in an absolutely appalling state, and the Islamic State themselves were still a couple of miles kind of flat no man's land between the Kurdish positions and their own positions. So we went there, and it was a scene of utter and literal desecration. So that's me looking miserable. I'm not a naturally brave person. If I'd known that I was going to end up in this terrible place being shelled by the Islamic State, I would never have gone. But this is the church in Sinjar, and you can see that the altar has been systematically smashed to pieces. And that is the font, and again you can see that it's been desecrated, everything's smashed to pieces, all the icons smashed onto the floor. That's a bomb in the front, right in the front. And there was a definite sense that what had particularly aggravated the fighters who came there and who desecrated the church was the cross. So again, to go back to that, that's why there was a very beautiful crucifix there. It had been demolished, and so that's why the people who came back have put the cross back up. So I found that unsettling, but most unsettling of all was the fate visited on the Yazidis, which was evident everywhere. So the Arabic writing is Yazidi, written up by presumably a Sunni Muslim in Sinjar, informing on his neighbors. It has been firebombed, the whole house has been destroyed. And to stand there amid the rubble and to think, people here were crucified. And we then got led out by a Kurdish captain out into the no man's land, where there was a huge barn where the Yazidi women had been taken, and those who were deemed to be attractive enough were taken off into slavery. Those who weren't were taken out and shot, and their bones were still lying in the dirt. And it was a terrifying and horrifying experience. But what I found most terrifying and most horrifying was the sense that I was in an environment, in a town that had been destroyed by people for whom the cross did not have the significance that it had for me and for the society in which I had grown up. That for the Islamic State, the cross served as a symbol of their right to inflict violence on people who resisted them. And this is what the cross had symbolized for the Romans. It had symbolized for them their right to torture to death anyone who presumed to defy their power. And the horror of this kind of seemed to open up a great abyss before me. And I came back from filming in Sinjar, came back from Iraq, returned to my book, and I rewrote the opening to focus on the crucifixion, because that experience had sharpened for me the utter strangeness of what perhaps can seem too familiar to people who have grown up in a Christian society. The weirdness of the fact that the symbol of Christianity, the great marker of its identity, should be an instrument of torture. Now, we know that this seemed very, very strange to the earliest Christians as well. And we know that because in the earliest Christian texts we have, the letters written by Paul, it haunts him. He's obsessed by the strangeness of the fact that the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah, who in some strange way that Paul can't quite pin down, is a part of the one God, the omnipotent, all-creating, all-powerful God. That he did not come as a conqueror, he did not come as a ruler of the world, but he came as someone who suffered the most monstrous death that the Roman Empire could inflict on its subjects. And it was a death that was inflicted not just on rebels against Roman power, although of course it was. I guess the second most famous victims of crucifixion are the followers of Spartacus. Those of you who have seen the Kirk Douglas film will remember the way that the general who defeats Spartacus and his armies puts crosses up along the entire Appian Way, the great road leading south from Rome. And these crosses serve as billboards, advertising both the general's power, but also a warning to any rebels who think about opposing Roman power. This will be your fate. And of course, the slaves, the followers of Spartacus, are slaves. And that's why this punishment was particularly appropriate for them. Because to the Romans, crucifixion was such a monstrous and horrifying punishment that it was seen as being the paradigmatic fate to be visited not just on rebels against Roman power, but specifically on slaves. And the reason that crucifixion was seen as the appropriate punishment to be inflicted on rebellious slaves was because it wasn't just because it was so painful, it wasn't just because it was protracted, but because it was public. And so your sufferings, your humiliations were visible for everyone to see. You would be nailed or tied or suspended from a piece of wood. People would gather and watch as birds flocked around your head, perhaps pecked out your eyes, perhaps attacked your genitals, because you would not be wearing a loincloth. You would be naked. They would watch you as you heaved your body frantically up and down, gasping for air. And when in due course you died, they would watch you, a slab of meat, nailed to a piece of wood. And the horror of this was the point. The visibility of it was the point. The humiliation was the point. And so this is why when Paul writes to communities of Roman citizens in Rome itself, in Corinth, in Galatia, he's upfront about the fact that the Messiah he is preaching, this Christ, the fact that he suffered crucifixion, is likely to seem, well, he says it's a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles, foolishness to the Greeks and to the Romans. And that is exactly the point. This is Hold on, let me see if I can. Sorry, no, I've missed one of the photos out. I do apologise. The fact that crucifixion is so disgusting is something that causes Paul anxiety. And it seems to have caused Christians anxiety throughout the early centuries of the spread of Christ's message across the Roman world. People know that Christ was crucified. They know that in some way this must have been the point, that Christ must have chosen this most humiliating of deaths, that in a way the last shall be first and the first shall be last, that this is the lesson. But they are also aware that it is likely to seem very, very repellent to the people that they are preaching this message to. And this seems to have been an issue even after the Roman Empire becomes Christian, even after Constantine, who of course sees a vision of a cross. It's on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. Even once the Roman Empire has become Christian, there seems to be a reluctance on the part of Christian artists to show and to illustrate Christ actually on the cross. And it's not until 100 years after the conversion of Constantine that we start to get art that shows Christ on the cross. So this is one of the earliest. It's an ivory, and it shows scenes from the Passion. So on the left, you have Judas hanging, in despair. And on the right, you have Christ on the cross. Now, what you will immediately notice about this is that it does not correspond to what an actual crucifixion would have been like. Christ is looking very, very serene. In fact, he's looking very, very buff. He looks like a kind of, a footballer in Qatar soaking up the rays before the big match. And he's got his loincloth on. And that is, the loincloth marks him out as an athlete. He is an athlete. He is someone who is going to conquer death in the great wrestling contest. And that sense of Christ as on the cross, as someone serene in his victory, is something that will pass into the Orthodox Church. So I went into one of the Orthodox churches here in Cluj today, and there was the image of Christ on the cross with a kind of very similar expression of serenity. And so that is very much part of the Orthodox tradition. You don't show the actual agonies of the crucifixion. But in the West, it was different. In the West, there came to be a growing focus on the agonies of Christ and his death. And so this is the first portrayal of Christ actually dead on the cross. It dates from around AD 1000, the first millennium. It's in a chapel in Cologne Cathedral in Germany. And over the course of the High Middle Ages, the centuries that followed the first millennium, more and more artists came to portray Christ as suffering the agonies that someone nailed to a cross would have suffered. It's vivid in the art, it's vivid in the liturgies, it's vivid in the prayers. Medieval Latin Christendom is a world haunted by the sufferings of Christ on the cross. And these sufferings are counterpointed to the glory of the resurrection. And this becomes an incredibly dynamic part of the way that Christians in the Latin West come to understand who Christ is and what the story of the Passion is all about. And I think that Christians in the West become so habituated to the horrors of the crucifixion that they end up anesthetized to them. They become oblivious to them. Which is why I think today, if you go into a church and you look at a crucifix, the agonies that Christ suffered are not vivid, I think, in most people's hearts and minds. It may be different in Romania. I think it's certainly the case in my country and across much of the West, that we've become desensitized to what crucifixion meant. And I think that is why I found the experience of going to Sinjar so unsettling and so upsetting. And the paradox is that I would say that of all the modern writers, all the modern thinkers who have written about the crucifixion, the one who understood the strangeness that lies at the heart of Christianity, the fact that the crucifixion utterly upended things that the Romans and the Greeks had taken for granted, was not actually a Christian at all, but perhaps the most notorious of all modern atheists. And here he is, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche said of the crucifixion that to devise something which could even approach the seductive, intoxicating, anesthetizing, and corrupting power of that symbol of the Holy Cross, that horrific paradox of the crucified God, that mystery of an inconceivably ultimate, most extreme, cruel, and self-crucifixion undertaken for the salvation of mankind, how revolting that was. And it seemed revolting to Nietzsche because Nietzsche valued the martial, heroic qualities of the Greek and Roman world, that he understood the crucifixion destabilized. And Nietzsche could see more clearly, I think, than anyone else has done, that the mark, the way in which the crucifixion stands at the heart of Christian society, has continued to shape its assumptions, its ideals, the things it takes for granted, even perhaps as institutional Christianity fades. So I would say, thinking about the communism that Romania suffered under, and many of you may find this a shocking thought, but I would say that even though it was hostile to Christianity, even though it destroyed and bulldozed churches, nevertheless, that communist regime would have been unthinkable without Christianity. The idea that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, fundamental to Marx's teachings. Where do they come from, if not from the Bible? The idea that there will be a day of reckoning, a day of judgment for the oppressors of the proletariat, a day of judgment. Again, unthinkable without the Bible. And even the way in which churches were smashed by people convinced that they were doing good, that they were doing right, that they were bringing people who had been living in darkness into light. That very process of iconoclasm, again, it's a very, very, very Christian assumption that you destroy buildings, you destroy idols, and you obtain enlightenment that way. So the paradox is, I think, that so deeply and profoundly does the cross lie at the heart of our civilization that even French revolutionaries, even Russian revolutionaries, even the regime that came to power here after the Second World War, unthinkable without Christianity, and perhaps to that degree Christian. But of course, Romania didn't just suffer from occupation, from communism. It also suffered from a very different form of totalitarianism. Nietzsche, when he prophesied the ultimate extinction of Christianity, he looked and he said, the destruction of Christianity, by which he meant not just institutional Christianity, but its beliefs and its values, will usher in a time of great convulsions, and deeds of terrible horror will be done. And he was right. I would say that if communism self-evidently bears the enduring stamp of Christianity, fascism, and Nazism perhaps especially, is the most radically anti-Christian ideology and therefore the most radically revolutionary ideology that has emerged in Europe since the time of Constantine. And that's not just because it aimed at the eradication of institutional Christianity, although it absolutely did. It's also because it targeted for destruction perhaps two of the most fundamental values that Christianity has always embodied, that are kind of bound up in Paul's letters and ever since with the idea of Christ's sufferings on the cross, and aimed to destroy them in a way that continues to reverberate into the present. So the first is the idea that Paul extrapolates from the fact that Christ suffered on the cross for all of humanity, not just for Jews, not just for Greeks, but for everybody. That in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, as Paul famously wrote to the Galatians. This is something that the Nazis utterly repudiate. Of course they think that Jews and Greeks are different. In fact, Hitler blames the Jews for Paul. He blames the Jews for Christianity. He blames the Jews for corrupting and destroying the civilization of Greece and Rome, which perhaps is the most grotesque irony in history, that Hitler targeted the Jews for genocide because he blamed them for Christianity. But the Nazis also repudiated the idea that is manifest in the emblem of the cross, that it is better to suffer than to inflict suffering, that it is better to be the slave who is tortured by the master than the master who is torturing the slave, that in humiliation and death there is ultimate triumph and victory. The Nazis radically repudiated that. They viewed weakness with contempt. And if it, in many ways, fascism was a movement that looked to the future, Mussolini, obsessed by planes and cars and tanks and all kinds of stuff, Hitler was a far more modern figure, say, than Churchill was. So at the same time, they did very consciously, rather as Nietzsche had done, look back to the pre-Christian world for the ideal of what they felt humanity should be, or at least the section of humanity that Hitler wanted to see triumph, namely conquest, power, strength, vigor, and that anything or anyone that opposed that had to be destroyed, which is why it wasn't only the Jews who were targeted for destruction, but those who were disabled, those who were weak, those who, back in Sparta, would have been flung down a cliff. And I think the shock of that for people in the West has given us a whole new post-Christian mythology. Because the reason that we in the West regard the Nazis as more evil than the communists, by and large, is because they practiced genocide for unacceptable reasons, for racist reasons, for reasons to do with the contempt for the weak. And that in turn means that in a society that is increasingly turning its back on the church, our horror at what the Nazis did give us a moral framework that remains Christian. So it's a moral framework in which Hitler is the devil, Nazis are demons, Auschwitz is hell. And if before the Second World War, people in the West would say, what should I do? I will do as Jesus did. Now when people say, what should I do? By and large, people say, I will do the opposite of what Hitler did. But I think the problem with this, for people in the West, is that merely calling people you don't like Nazis lacks the incredible complexity, the sophistication, the compassion, the moral profundity that Christianity for 2,000 years has embodied. And I think it's a kind of ersatz form of Christianity, just deriving our morals from a sense of what Hitler was and doing the opposite, I think in the long run is inadequate, which is why I'm so grateful for the invitation to come and talk to you today, and grateful for what you do, because I think that Christianity is the seedbed of everything that makes the West what it is. And without it, I kind of worry where we may end up. So thank you very much.